Our next speaker is Christina Norman. She's a lead designer at Riot on League of Legends and also works on the Mass Effect series. I'm really excited to have her because of there are two realms in the game industry that I'm really interested in. Independent games, where there's so much happening, so much going on, but there's just as much interesting stuff, and I think actually really revolutionary stuff happening in esports. And probably one of the biggest, definitely one of the biggest, most important esports right now is League of Legends. So I'm really excited to hear Christina's perspective on the game and that its development. So, all right, this is it.
Thanks, everyone. Can you guys hear me okay like this?
Good.
Okay, awesome. So just so I have an idea of everyone's background here, who here before today had heard of League of Legends? Okay, great. Who here has played League of Legends? Wow, that's pretty good. Okay, awesome. I'm still gonna, for those of you who haven't, I'm gonna take you through so that the lecture is relevant to everybody. So this talk today is about creative development in League of Legends, but the principles I'm going to be talking about are widely applicable, particularly for games that are kind of starting out in creative development or trying to figure out how can we build a really awesome creative team that can make a great creative game. So my intro's already been well covered, but yeah, I work at Riot. Right now I'm leading creative design. I'm kind of a design ninja. I go wherever Riot needs me to do whatever needs to be improved, and right now, creative is my main focus. Before at BioWare, I worked on the Mass Effect series. I've been lucky to have a lot of different jobs in the industry. On Mass Effect 1, I was the lead programmer for their conversation and cinematic system, which went on to be used in Dragon Age, Star Wars: The Old Republic, and so on. And then in Mass Effect 2 and Mass Effect 3, I had the opportunity to work on really overhauling the gameplay, particularly combat, but also the RPG systems. For Mass Effect 2, I did a talk about that at GDC a few years back. And Mass Effect 3, I did the core design for their multiplayer. So different hats. One of the things I love about the games industry is that you can just kind of move around and do all kinds of different things if that's what you're into. So what is League of Legends? Just like a few facts about it. Currently, it's the most played video game in the world, defined by hours of play. It's a MOBA, which stands for Multiple Online Battle Arena. The core idea there is you have two teams. They're in an arena, and they're fighting over objectives, and you've got a three-quarter camera view. Those are kind of like the core tenets of what is a MOBA. And there's 106 champions. 107 champions. We release a new champion every 2 to 4 weeks, so while I was working on these slides, we released a new champion, Zed, the Master of Shadows. He's really scary. And right now, we've got about 32 million active players every month. Put that in perspective, the population of Canada, which I'm from, is 34 million, so we're pretty close to having the equivalent of every Canadian in the world playing the game. And if you add up all the hours of play each month, it works out to 1 billion hours. I calculated that in terms of human lifespans, but that was kind of a depressing way of presenting the numbers. So I went back to just saying 1 billion hours. And that works out to an average of 30 hours a month per player, which is a pretty high level of engagement for an average player. And we're not really a narrative-focused game, so I'm going to just show a little clip of gameplay. This is from the recent World Finals event we had in Los Angeles. We had over 1 million people online simultaneously watching this event. This is like our esports things.
They're going to try and catch on towards Aaron here. Have they got the damage? The second teleport comes in. Big penalty. Oriana ultimate. The Nexus is exposed, and someone is going to take the Nexus down. No, Kevin gets in there. Absolutely obliterates him. The boy went round the back. He got it.
So just some of the key stuff there to sort of highlight what you're seeing there. You got two teams fighting. There's a lot of player versus player combat, focus on objectives, destroying that nexus, but it's a sport. You see, we've got player cameras there, we have commentators talking about it. People are getting really excited, and that's really cool. I think like as far as getting games out there and making them accessible to more people, I'm really excited about the possibility that esports present to make games an experience you can have by watching the game. But at the same time, this is not really a very narrative experience. So you might ask, why worry about story if we're not a narrative-focused game? The answer is, because we're a character-focused game, we have 106 champions out there, and as you play this game, you start to form relationships with these champions. Players pick champions not only because they've got really good skills, but just because they like them. I do this myself. There's champions I don't like to play this one champion, Graves. He looks kind of like a cowboy, and I'm not into cowboys. So instead I play different characters who fulfill a similar role that are more appealing to me. And I have cosplay photos up here because I think cosplay is one of this great sort of benchmarks for understanding mainstream character appeal. If your characters in your video game are really appealing, people are going to want to dress up as them. People are going to want to see them, pictures of people dressed up as them. This works for other games too, like Minecraft, for example. There's cosplay photos all over the place. But yeah, what this is really highlighting is that players form these deep emotional relationships with champions, and they want to be those champions. They're not like just chess pieces being moved around on a board. And players are engaging outside of the game already in a really intense way. So I already mentioned that players are spending on average 30 hours a month playing. When they're not playing, they're on forums, they're on Reddit, they're on YouTube, they're watching live streams of people playing the game. We can't measure how much time they're spending on this, but we know that people spend a significant amount of time there. So we don't know what the total out-of-game engagement time is for our player base. But what we do know is that, at least in North America, players like these types of stories. And we're trying to understand this internationally as well, because we're a very international game. And it just kind of makes sense. If players really are enjoying experiencing great stories, and there's this game that they spend so much time with, and these characters that they really, really love, it's pretty reasonable to conclude that if we were giving them excellent stories about League of Legends, they would want to hear those stories. But before we can tell those great stories, we need to do some work on our lore. So I'm going to show you a 1-minute video that kind of is a basic introduction to League of Legends lore. We didn't produce this. This was produced by Total Biscuit.
In the magical world of Runeterra, there exists an island, Valoran, which houses two sworn enemies, Demacia and Noxus. Demacia, the self-proclaimed shining example of humanity, rules with an iron fist in the name of justice and morality. Noxus, on the other hand, is a power-hungry faction that enjoys ruining your day. After 2 rune wars, Valoran had transformed into a hellish landscape. Valoran's top boys ruled that the magical warfare was causing earthquakes and storms, and maybe hurting the poor ozone layer. They responded by creating the League of Legends, a method in which political disputes would be settled in arenas called the Fields of Justice, Summoner's Rift, and the Crystal Scar. Oh, and Twisted Treeline, but nobody likes Twisted Treeline. Champions summoned by, well, summoners duking out in the Fields of Justice, all the while trying to destroy each other's nexus. These brave champions lead mindless minions to victory and/or their death, which are controlled by novice summoners. But let's face it, minions are only there as a source of revenue so you can rush your Trinity Force. Even though most disputes are settled on the Fields of Justice, there are still conflicts over land and whatnot, especially between the Demacian King's son, Jarvan IV, and Noxian commander creepy bird guy, Swain. Even then, nobody questions the effectiveness of the League of Legends because it's backed by 3 powerful, broken OP summoners, and hey, when you can fight robots and children and the guy from 300 to death, who really cares? Go forth, conquer your enemies, and always call dibs on solo lane summoner. Oh, and remember, spin to win, kids. Have fun.
So that was actually pretty accurate. It's poking fun in a good-natured way, but it's revealing key issues. Like, every fact that he stated in there is basically true. And so our lore has issues, but a reasonable question might be why? Christina, why are you here presenting instead of actually fixing those issues? So let me talk about them a bit. So the lore of our game is actually pretty appropriate for a small action game. When we were building League of Legends, we weren't really thinking that it was going to have as wide reach and appeal. And this lore may not be great for producing amazing stories, but that really just wasn't our focus. When we initially launched, our first target in terms of success was 20,000 concurrent users. Just as a way of measuring popularity, concurrent users is a really good metric for multiplayer games. And we're currently at about 3 million concurrent users as our top figure every week, which is 150 times our initial goal. So we've just kind of really, we've reached a lot more players than we initially thought. So it's fine. I mean, we built our lore with a certain expectation. The results are different. We should now re-examine that and say, okay, what do we have to do to get our lore to the right level to support that high a player base who is highly engaged? So I'm going to go over what I see as 4 key issues that we need to resolve at Riot to be able to deliver to players the types of stories that they want to hear and that they deserve. So the first is tournament IP. And when I say tournament IP, what I'm saying is that our lore was built to explain this magical tournament that's going on in game. Really similar to Mortal Kombat. Like with Mortal Kombat, everything revolves around that tournament where guys are facing off, they're having death matches, and the fate of the world hangs on that tournament. In the same way, in our game, we have these magical arenas called Fields of Justice. And the 2 teams that are facing each other and fighting are actually trying to decide really important things like who's going to get this land, and will there be a surtax on grain, and other really issues of health or otherwise. So, but this has problems. So the first problem is that this approach to lore restricts conflict because it focuses all of the action on these magical tournaments. Conflict is one of the key things you want to have in storytelling, and a lot of conflict types we might be interested in exploring, things like war, for example, we can't really explore within these constraints. There's also the fact that while our players really love champions in our game, the people who are actually in control of our world are summoners. They're these wizards. They are broken OP, as Total Biscuit eloquently put it, and they kind of control everything. So it kind of makes you want to tell stories about summoners, but that isn't what our players really want. So we've got a situation where we're limited in the stories we can tell, and our heroes don't really have the agency we'd like them to have. Another problem is that we over-explain things in our lore. Now, when the focus is entirely on the tournament, again, this is perfectly fine. It makes sense that players might, if they're trying to form a cohesive vision of the world, want to understand why certain things that happen in game also happen in the world. But many of these are counterintuitive. For example, we have some characters in the game who are siblings, Garen and Lux, for example. And in game, you can have a situation where Garen is on one team and Lux is on another. Now, these are two, not only are they siblings, but they're from the same royal military family. They should have the same interest in pretty much everything. But in our game, they can meet in the middle of the battlefield and just kill each other. Doesn't make a lot of sense. We chose to explain that. We explained that in that moment when Garen and Lux are fighting, they're actually not completely in control of themselves. The summoners are basically directing their actions. That's really disempowering and unintuitive. Sorry sis, I'm sorry I killed you, but a wizard was mind controlling me, and Hebrew. It's a weird situation. And also, just as another example, when champions in this magical tournament die, they don't really die. Basically, they're caught at the moment of death and magically transported away and then brought back a few minutes later. And that really saps tension out of conflict. I mean, death is, again, a really powerful storytelling device. And at least with the context of these magical tournaments, no one can die. So the end result is this and other explanations of IP mechanics result in an awkward and unbelievable world. So we have a tournament IP, but what we want it to have to be able to tell players all these stories is an awesome IP. So how do we get there? It's really kind of obvious, but the most important thing is to just observe that, understand it, and say, that's what we want. Then you can start talking about the methods of actually getting there. So in our case, I think the key principles is first, we have to respect what the players already love about our world. we have highly engaged fans, and even though our lore isn't perfect, our fans are highly engaged in that lore. So we need to make sure that throughout this entire process, we understand what really appeals to them, and we don't break the things that they really love. But we still need to be able to revise the fundamental rules of our universe when necessary. We need to start taking a look at things like summoner mind control and cheating death. These are things we may have to change. And we need to make sure that we're telling stories that occur outside of the League of Legends. Even though the IP is really directing us to say, hey, talk about this magical tournament, we need to go outside of there. So we're going to need to make these necessary changes so we can tell great stories. So the key takeaway regarding tournament IP is that we need to develop our IP and build it into something more so that we can tell great stories that are occurring outside of the league. So the next thing I want to talk about is character depth. Now I'm going to reveal a key secret of storytelling to all of you today. And that secret is stories are more engaging when characters have depth. And at the simplest level, when I say depth, I'm saying there's something that's below the surface. You need to understand who a character is. That's the bit at the top, but you want a lot of stuff below the surface for people to explore. And we all know characters who have these qualities, like Tony Soprano. You have to go through all the seasons of The Sopranos to really get a full understanding of this character. Or Don Draper. At the start, he feels very self-assured, in control, but as you learn more about him, you realize he's not always in control. He's struggling to maintain control. And it's that depth that you explore through stories that makes these characters truly compelling. So let's compare one of our champions to these guys. We're going to talk about Mordekaiser. Now Mordekaiser is awesome. I'm going to tell you guys a little bit about him in case you don't know. He's basically this undead death knight with a giant mace. And he's so powerful that when he hits you with his mace, he's probably going to hit 3 or 4 other people nearby. It's just, that's how hard he hits you. And if he kills you, he's going to actually rip your soul out of your body and make your soul kill your friends. He's a badass. Pikachu is also a badass. Pikachu is so badass that on your birthday, he does 50 extra damage. So what Mordekaiser and Pikachu have in common is that they're awesome, they've got a lot of personality, but they don't have a lot of depth. When you try and scratch below the surface for Mordekaiser, there isn't that much there. He's a badass undead guy that wants to kill you. So the creative process that got her there, which is not a bad creative process, it's not just ideal, I'm going to go over now. This is sort of what we applied when we were making our first 100 or so champions. So we'd have a writer. All of our employees look something like this, screaming into microphones. It's pretty normal. And that writer would get inspired. The muse would strike, and they would have an idea for a champion. And then they would go and they'd write up that champion's story in the form of a 1 to 2 page bio. Then we do peer review. Peer review is awesome because it stops really bad ideas from getting out there. And as part of that peer review, we give feedback and we iterate. And this is a pretty good process for producing bios, and it's a pretty good basic creative process. But it's only really leveraging the intelligence and inspiration of one person. It's not the best way of building a character with depth. Like, even though in TV you're going to have creative leaders out there who are really instrumental in creating compelling characters, generally speaking, there's more than one person who's involved in that process. And we don't want to create characters like Mordekaiser. We want to create characters like Tony Soprano and Don Draper. So I had to do something simple. I mean, I've never actually done this, so I decided to take a look at how are characters like that actually created. And so I started studying TV's writers' rooms. I talked to writers in TV, and the process we developed, which is based off of the TV writer room creative process, goes something like this. So this is probably the most complicated slide in the presentation, but it's probably also the most important. So I'm going to outline a creative process, and while this is the process we use for creating champions, it's very adaptable. So we start off with a key difference. Instead of having one person who kind of owns a champion and is providing creative direction on that champion, we start off in a group. And that group consists of writers, but it's interdisciplinary as well. We have animators, artists, gameplay designers, anyone who essentially has an interest in this character. We get them in a room and we talk for a minimum of 4 hours about the character. It sometimes goes as long as 12 hours over different sessions. I'm sure it's even gone longer. During this process, we make all the major decisions where we plan on making about this character, and then we define the bio slice. So if you remember that iceberg photo that I showed you earlier, the slice would be kind of what's at the top. It's like the first episode of the TV series where you learn the basic of who is this character, what do they want, what's going on with them, what are their relationships. It's that most important information that is the starting point for telling their story. After that, a writer takes notes. Those notes are reviewed by the group and approved, and then the bio is written to the notes. So the key difference between that and the traditional bio writing process is that in this process of writing up the bio, you don't actually make any major decisions. Those were all made by the group. And in fact, anyone who is involved in that group discussion who has writing skills should actually be able to take those notes and write up that bio, because everyone in that group should understand who that character is. Once the bio is written, it's reviewed by the group and it's validated against the notes to make sure there hasn't been a character drift. Sometimes new issues come up, or we even go back and revise, but any revisions to who that character is done by the group. And this is a very powerful, collaborative, creative process. So, and collaboration is key. I've heard that word mentioned throughout the conference. It's very powerful to leverage the creativity of multiple people. But this process isn't perfect. So the key drawbacks are it takes a lot of people and a lot of time. For anyone here who's worked in game development, you know that 4-hour meetings are generally not considered to be a good thing. Meetings with lots of people are generally not considered to be a good thing, but those sorts of things are really important. It was a little counterintuitive for me as well. I'm used to coming to decisions very, very quickly when they need to be made. But with character discovery, you really need time. You need time to go off on tangents and to just talk about things until suddenly a spark will hit someone, they'll mention it, and other people in the room will say, that's a great idea, we should totally use that. You also need a showrunner. Taking that term again from the TV industry. You need to have someone in that group who is essentially a creative lead, and their job is to guide discussion and to curate and to help discover the best ideas. Collaborative development is great, but design by committee is not. It tends to produce weak, average ideas. The showrunner is the person who will sometimes champion for specific ideas and argue why the group should look in a certain direction. And if you're thinking about applying this process in your own game, then keep in mind that deviating from these principles is going to affect your results. It's very easy to design a stripped down version of this where it's 3 people in a room talking for an hour, but you're really not going to get the same kind of results you're going to get out of taking as much time as is necessary and having a skilled creative leader really leading discussion. And the benefits you're going to get are higher quality results, more creativity, because it doesn't matter how creative you are, a group of people working with you is going to be more creative. And you're also going to get team buy-in and shared vision. And I showed this presentation to someone else and they said, hey, you actually have to tell people why team buy-in and shared vision is important. To me it seems pretty self-evident, but to produce a character who is creatively cohesion, who has creative cohesion, you need team buy-in and shared vision. So what I mean by that is, let's say you've got a modeler and an animator. If everyone really understands who this character is, they're going to produce results that just very subtly work together in a much better way. I'm going to give an example. We have death animations for our characters in the game. So when people die, they can do interesting things. because we had the animator involved in working on Zed, the ninja I showed you earlier, he's like this shadow ninja. And we came up with this idea that was really cool, that when he died, instead of actually dying, he would clutch his chest, drop to the ground, and then he'd start doing all of these signs, and then he'd basically dissolve into shadows. And the cool thing about that is that makes it seem like he's somehow cheated or escaped death to return, instead of having a very, very gamey metaphor of, well, you die and then you respawn. So, but we might not have realized that opportunity if we hadn't had the animator in the room when we were talking about his character. And the end result is that a great character is going to be worth all of this effort. I'm not trying to say that Zed is Tony Soprano, or Darius, the guy up here, is Don Draper, but they are both higher quality characters than what we produced before, and a character is forever. So we applied this process to Mordekaiser, and this is kind of the results we got. So he's a badass undead general. Same as before, but now he's a general. He's got an army somewhere. His motivation is he wants to schedule an invasion. He's probably playing war games on it right now, trying to figure out those details. He wants to take out the world of the living. And he has relationships. So there's this undead centaur guy named Hecarim, who's his military peer, and this evil lich named Karthus, who's his advisor. He's not solo. He's got friends of a sort to help him out. But there are some complications, and some of this information is even, you can go post it on the board or whatever, and people will think you're cool. His army is held back by a magical curse, so he can't just invade until he deals with that curse. And the other complication is he's forgotten who he was before he died. And what I'm trying to speak to with that is just the simple idea that sometimes through self-discovery, we think we know who we are, but then in certain situations we realize that there's more to us than we know. Quite literally with Mordekaiser, we can now put him in situations where something will spark a memory of his life, and he'll have some understanding of who he was before he died, and that may influence his actions going forward. So I think that this is a good step forward. I think this is a character who could be worthy of writing an entire TV series about. Might not turn out to be The Sopranos or Mad Men, but it's a good step forward. So the main takeaway from character development, I'd say, is that collaborative development is key for building stronger characters. And it's worth that investment. So moving on to the next section, I'm going to talk about world depth. So again, pretty obvious, you're going to want to have a deep world, but the reason why is because that's going to provide the foundation for your stories. So League of Legends has a bunch of factions already. You see all these green arrows which are flying around. Those are all factions on our world. But those factions are not really well defined beyond saying they exist. So I'm going to talk about the Shadow Isles, which is where Mordekaiser is from. Before we took another look at it, the Shadow Isles was basically a land of evil undead dudes. You could kind of conclude it's an island. Hopefully they don't have boats, but there wasn't really anything out there about it. So for building great factions, I wanted to look outside of video games, and that's kind of another, I guess, takeaway theme is it's great to study video game narrative, but you don't feel constrained to that. It's worth looking outside, particularly in the case of a game like League of Legends, where our main interest in terms of narrative is not actually putting more narrative in the game, it's developing narrative outside of the game. So, Game of Thrones, House Lannister, it's a great faction. Let's talk a little bit about why it's great. So, first let's talk about who the Lannisters are, and this is obviously a huge oversimplification, but they're key points that I feel are very relevant. They're selfish and they're opportunistic. They're always going to back the winning side. They're vengeful. A Lannister always pays his debts. You can interpret that statement in a bunch of different ways. And they're arrogant. They think that they always know the right answer and that they're better than anyone else. So the interesting thing about that is that we've got 3 different Lannisters here, and you can learn more about the Lannister faction by studying each of these characters. And you can study these characters, you can study the faction, it works both ways, basically. Like one way I like to put it is, imagine if Tyrion was a Stark. He would be a completely different character. So on the left side, Tywin, he's brutal and he's efficient and he wants his legacy intact. He's getting old. He was the one who actually helped cause the Lannisters to rise up after his father bungled things. And he's worried right now that when he's gone, they're gonna fall again. He'll do anything to stop that from happening. Tyrion is fiercely loyal and soft-hearted, and he desperately wants to prove himself. Everyone is literally looking down on him, and he wants to show them that he's every bit a Lannister that everyone else is. But at the same time, he's not willing to lower himself to the same depths that some of the other Lannister characters go to. And then there's Jaime. Jaime seems like he has it all. He's arrogant, he's mocking, he's charming, he's brave, and he loves his sister. He just feels like he has it all. So imagine if we were able to produce a faction with this kind of depth in League of Legends. So the process we use is essentially the same as the character development process. I'm not going to go over it again, but the keys are collaborative development, an individual then doing deep dive development, with a group then validating that development that occurred. So let's talk about the Shadow Isles 2.0. And yeah, so this artwork was actually really important. We spent a lot of time working over ideas. We didn't want to actually get too far into development until we had some way of visualizing it. And the artwork was actually inspired by X-ray flower photography. I saw this and I thought, wouldn't it be really cool to have an undead world which isn't so much focused on zombies and skeletons, but if just everything around you was dead, like what does the soul of a flower look like? And I didn't really want it to be just a dark, gloomy, evil place. I wanted there to be some beauty to it. So the end result of what we developed has some of these qualities. Life doesn't belong here in the Shadow Isles. I'm trying to capture that sense that it's this alien place where if you step into it and you're a living person, you're not just scared, you're not just worried someone's gonna come and kill you, but you'll just have this feeling deep inside you that this is not the right place for you to be. As I discussed, the trees and flowers are spectral, and there's a trap associated with being there. If you die in the Shadow Isles, that's how you become undead, and you'll stay there forever. So it's a pretty scary place. And the Shadow Isles characters, we wanted them to be more than just an undead horde. So we tried with each character to find a different reflection on what the Shadow Isles is. So on the left we have Mordekaiser, who we've already talked about. And I mentioned, I think earlier on, that in game he can like rip your soul out and make you kill your friends. We want to incorporate that into his character. So he's also an interrogator, but what makes him truly terrifying is that he doesn't torture you. He kills you and then he interrogates your soul after you're already dead. And then we have Elise in the middle. She lures people in. She's the leader of the spider-worshipping cult. And she tells them how great the spider god is, and then she takes them on a boat ride to the Shadow Isles, feeds them to their god, and they never return. And then there's Karthus. In our world, it's not Twilight. Being undead is not sexy and cool. Karthus is the only man in our world who was so obsessed with death, he didn't feel that revulsion. He felt drawn to the Shadow Isles, and he chose to become undead. So what I hope you can see is how the elements of these different characters help form a basis for us to tell more interesting stories about our undead world, and how you can learn more about our undead world from these characters. So the key takeaway is this reciprocal relationship. Great characters are going to help you understand your world, and a great world is going to help you understand your characters. And it's useful to try and compartmentalize in groups and think about how individuals belonging to a faction, association, region, or whatnot will help you learn more about that faction, association, or region. Okay, so on to the last problem I want to talk about today. It's what I call the wall of text. So up until recently, this was our only real narrative tool. You go to the web page and you get to read this bio. Don't worry about reading the bio. But we would literally try and cram everything into there because it was our only narrative tool. We try and cram all the facts about the world, all the relationships. We just jam all of that in. Because when your only tool is a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. And this is something for designers in particular to be aware of. Designers are actually really good at taking whatever tools they have available and building a complete experience. But just because you have a limited series of tools doesn't mean you should actually use them to build that complete experience if your goal is quality. If your goal is quality, you need to constantly question whether or not the tools you have at hand are actually going to produce the experience you want. And then if they won't, you need to raise that as an issue, because it isn't always going to be obvious to everybody else on the team what they're giving up by not properly investing in tools and methods. So we need more tools. We've been developing some tools. This is a starting point. So the first tool we developed is login screen VO. So the login screen, that's how you get into the game. Generally you run it, there's a cool graphic and there's some music. What if we started putting some story in there? And I'm going to show you the results. Now just a little bit of context, but this is very important. We didn't want to hit players over the head with VO every time they ran the client, because eventually people would just be typing as fast as they could to get rid of the annoying VO, or they would disable it completely. So we delayed it for 30 seconds on purpose, so players would need to discover it. And that actually worked out way better than we thought, because players were delighted when they discovered it, because they didn't know it was there, and because they happened on it by chance, they discovered it, and then they told other people about it, and then people started listening intentionally. All right, I'm gonna play this for you now.
The Shadow Isles. They say they don't exist. Mythical islands haunted by ghosts and specters. Tales to frighten children. But I know better. I have been there. When I first set foot there, I immediately knew something was wrong with that place. My skin crawled, and in the pit of my stomach, I felt a terrible revulsion. Life didn't belong there, but I also knew, somehow deep inside I knew, that the islands welcomed me. They wanted me. As I wandered deeper, I saw death all around me. Ghostly trees, grass, and flowers engulfed me in their horrifying radiance. It was so quiet and so beautiful. I passed my hand through a spectral leaf fluttering in the wind, but there was no wind. That was when I understood that death was another world, and I was at its door. Then I heard the song. The spider's song. My companion cried out in terror and fell to his knees. I embraced him. I told him he had nothing to fear. He was going to a better place. I will take them all to a better place.
So yeah, we were really trying to capture with that the feel of the Shadow Isles. And the really nice thing is that players who had no real awareness of other aspects of our lore would hear this, and then they'd become interested in learning more. So this was a way for us to reach players who we weren't currently engaging with. Another way in which we're experimenting with incorporating more narrative into the game in a subtle way that doesn't interfere with the core activity of killing people is limited in-game VO. Now, in-game VO is not a particularly innovative tool. Certainly, RPGs have been doing this forever. The trick was to find the right way to put it into our game in a way that it wouldn't interfere with the core player experience and would provide value. So I'm going to explain a little bit about this before I run the video clip. In the Twisted Treeline map, which is thematically, it's set in the Shadow Isles, when you capture an altar, a specter appears and says a single line of voiceover. The key things that make this work is the voiceover is optional. You don't need to listen to it if you don't want to. And it's primarily focused on flavor. We also have a lot of variety. We don't want players to start hearing the same lines over and over and get bored of them. And there's some aspect of discovery because different characters will hear different lines. So as players get an understanding of that, it makes it more interesting for them when they go up and have this experience of capturing the altar, because they're going to learn different things depending on who they're playing. Now, I didn't plan it this way, but when I recorded this, I was actually attacked while I was capturing the altar, so you're going to get a more legitimate representation of an in-game experience where actual combat is going on while the Spectre is talking to you.
The altars have awoken. Nothing escapes my web.
Yeah, so not sure if you caught it, but the Spectre said, "The spider welcomes you, Elise," which is calling specifically back to her relationship with the undead spider that lives on this map. So the other things that we've been exploring are themed content releases. This is another way of subtly reinforcing lore to players without hitting them over the head. Now, we release all kinds of content to our players, but generally speaking, at least in the past, the content has been based off of just what were the best ideas and when were they done. So it'd be kind of random. You just have content from all over the place. We decided for Halloween to try and release a bunch of content which all had a common theme, namely the Shadow Isles. So we planned ahead, and we had a champion we released at that time, Elise, the Spider Queen, who you just saw. We also did a bunch of skins. That's a major type of content we produce for our players, which is essentially outfits for champions. They're insanely popular. They have no gameplay impact whatsoever, but players love them. And we also introduced 2 new types of content we hadn't released before. Ward skins. Wards are these little things you can drop in maps that grant vision of an area. We gave you the ability to customize the appearance of your ward skin. And icons. We created new player icons themed around the Shadow Isles that players could get. We also released the Twisted Tree line at that time, which is the Shadow Isles themed map. So this was the biggest content release we've ever done before, period, and it was also cohesively themed around the Shadow Isles. Again, the nice thing there is players don't need to understand this because all the content is still the sort of content they appreciate in game, but seeing all of this content being related actually, in a way, increases the value that each individual piece of content has for the player. Like, for example, if we just released one of these icons, you might have said, oh, it's a scary icon, that's kind of cool. But now you know that when you pick one of these icons, you're actually, in a way, engaging the Shadow Isles and all those other aspects of the Shadow Isles lore that we've been releasing to players. So the point of all this is we want to develop new ways of communicating stories to our player. I've been talking with you about some of the in-game stuff we've been doing, which we want to keep really subtle. But in the future, we want to go out of game because our players have shown that they really like engaging with us outside of games. So things like movies, comic books, novels, these are all possibilities that we would be interested in exploring. So the key takeaway for each of these problems is we should develop our IP so we can support telling great stories that occur outside of the League of Legends tournament structure. We want to invest in characters with depth, and we think the key to getting there is collaborative development. And those characters are going to benefit if we put that same effort into developing a rich, vibrant, deep world. And we need to develop new narrative tools for reaching our players. So thank you. My contact information is up here, and I'd love to take your questions.
Awesome. I think we have time for maybe 2 or 3 questions.
So it seems like you talked a lot about how you come up with champions from a very creative and narrative perspective, but does it also happen where you come up with a champion based off of like a novel idea for a specific ability or a specific kit or a specific role that you feel like you need to fill? And then if you come at it from that perspective, how does that affect sort of the process that you described of sort of creatively
Sure.
coming up with their
So
vibe?
I'll talk a bit more about the process. The champion creation process is very open. Anyone in the company can submit an idea for a champion, and we actually have no structure for how those ideas should be submitted. We tried structuring, but we found it actually confused the process, and people felt more like they were taking a test or something, and they sometimes provided too much information. So ideas will sometimes come inspired by visuals, sometimes character, sometimes gameplay. But once that idea comes, it goes through a curation process where a small team will take a look at it and try and figure out the basics of, can we put this together? Once we've gone through that sort of initial evaluation process, that's when we turn it over to a group to fully develop. And at that point, we're gonna flesh out the art, we're gonna flesh out the gameplay, we're gonna flesh out the story. We produce something called a one sheet, which is a one-page summary of who this character is. That's another recommendation I have. The longer I stay in the industry, the shorter my documentation becomes. No one reads documentation. No one ever reads documentation. They'll read like API references and stuff when they need to use them. So people love referencing documentation to find information they need, but they're not interested in reading long documents. So if you can tell something in one page, do it that way.
A lot of the best skins are really zany and wacky references to contemporary pop culture or totally outside the world of the lore. Are you going to move away from that, or how does that going to affect?
Sure. So first I'll say is we definitely consider skins to exist outside of lore and to be an opportunity for expression and fun. So we're definitely not planning on changing that. With that said, there have been some interesting developments, very player-driven developments. We've been doing skin lines. For example, we have a skin line called Battlecast, which is essentially turning our most big evil champions into mechs. And players have started coming up with this narrative for the Battlecast world, and they're imagining it's this dark future where this other character, Victor the Machine Mage, who is one of our champions, is essentially converting people into robots, which is kind of his grand evil vision. And we find that idea pretty compelling. So we wouldn't ever want to make something like that canon, but we may want to actually support in select cases saying with this particular skin line, let's provide some thematic background to reinforce the stories that the players are already finding within that skin line. And if players want themselves to explore stories in the Battlecast version of League of Legends, I think that's amazing.
I'm looking forward to League of Legends 40K. Take one in the back right there.
So you're talking about like team buy-in as a result of the collaborative process, but do you ever find that can backfire and say somebody's idea gets shot down during the meeting and then they have negative feelings toward that character moving forward?
So part of being in the writer's room is you learn to deal with the fact that 90% of ideas are shot down. So far we haven't had a lot of problems there. Initially, when people get in there, they can find it a little bit confusing, but you talk them through that, and eventually people realize that, yeah, 90% of ideas are going to get shot down. Everyone is having ideas shot down all the time. Only the very best ideas are making it to the surface. And often we'll say stuff like, you know what, that is an amazing idea, but not for this character for these reasons. So there's a difference between an idea being accepted for a character and it being a good or bad idea.
Actually, I have a real question. So you're new to Riot, right? You've just been hired recently. So
Year and a half.
Yeah, so year and a half. So you're maybe one of the newer members. I'm interested from your perspective, also seeing that you move around a lot in the company. What do you feel like there's a different culture between people who are primarily involved maybe in sort of game balancing and making gameplay tweaks and people who are working on the lore? Like, are those two things really wrapped together at Riot, or do you feel like there's different cultures there?
So Riot has a pretty open culture, and by that I mean we encourage anyone to give feedback on anything. And we also believe that smart people, creative people, like to do different things. They don't like to be put in a box and told, just do this for the next 5 years. So our culture supports moving around a lot and open communication. With that said, I mean, in some cases, some people do specialize and they do tend to focus more on whatever it is their interests are, like say game balance. And if that's what they want to do, that's perfectly fine. It's still important that everyone has a certain level of education though, which is why this presentation, elements of it were adapted from our presentation I gave to the whole company. We want to make sure that everyone is aware of the major sort of efforts that are going on in different areas like creative development.
First I have a short question. How many hours a week do you spend playing League of Legends? Just curious.
I average about 20.
And is
Yeah,
that-
I'm
is that-
below average.
Is that below average for people at the company?
So the thing is, when I say 20, I mean 20 not at work hours. So at work, I'll play, I'll help test builds. I would say probably most people at the company average, 20 is probably pretty close to average. And I think this is a phenomenon a lot of people who develop games understand. You play more games before you develop games than when you start developing games because you work 50 to 60 hours a week and there's only so much time in a day. But the great thing is developing games is just a different kind of relationship with games. So I find working on building games satisfies a lot of what before satisfied me about playing games.
So that was just my warm up. I'm curious. You're clearly, even as you put it, sort of the whole IP or the whole company game is backing into this idea of a film or novel or comic book style narrative IP. And so I think that it's sort of a fascinating case study in this sort of eternal game design question of gameplay and content or narrative and interactivity, whatever you want to call it. Because it strikes me that thinking of character as a deep character with psychological depth, I'm not sure that's necessarily appropriate to game characters, right? I mean, part of what makes, you have 107 characters, and like Pokemon, another way of thinking about it is also that they're sort of all about surface, and that the surface become, the reason why they're sort of cartoony and exaggerated is those surfaces are like the handles.
I have the answer to the question you haven't asked. But here's the answer. So the key thing there is what you don't want to do is have like this character go, oh yeah, this character's really amazing once you get to know them. He's like angry and mischievous stuff. You need to have a simple in-game metaphor for what appeals to you about the character. So take Mordekaiser, for example. Mordekaiser is still this badass undead champion who wants to kill you. We didn't take that away from him. We added on depth, but we understand that these characters need a simple appeal. They need a strong personality, a presence in game that will make them appealing. We've always been good at doing that, and we're still doing that. It's just that there is additional depth there. And there is some risk as well. There's risk that we will never actually do a story about Mordekaiser, and in a sense that depth will be wasted. I'm not that concerned about that because I'm more concerned about missing the opportunity that we might be able to do with that character. So I'm in a way, it's kind of interesting because there is no planned League of Legends movie or anything. It's not like I'm working towards a goal like 2015, League of Legends movie, make it happen.
You heard it here first.
I am literally working on foundation. I'm saying, we know we want to tell these sorts of stories, let's work on foundation. And part of that is getting the organization to understand how to do these sorts of things. So if, for example, we decide 2015, League of Legends movie, Noxus versus Demacia, we need these characters developed, the organization will know how to do that.
I guess where I was going was that the League of Legends is so amazing in terms of the player culture and the depth of it, the tournament culture, as a game, as a competitive sport. Maybe because of, or maybe despite of all of the interesting surface complexity and lore of the world and the characters. And I think that I don't know, what the company seems to be doing is wanting to go to a very traditional place, a movie and film narrative. So I wonder if
you say why? Like why do you guys want to make cartoon comic books and
well, I see why, because it's a business.
Is it a business? That's my question. Is it a business?
But I wonder if there's another model for narrative that somehow is, I don't know what it would be. So this is the unsolved problem that doesn't try and fit the square peg of a game into the round hole of a film property, but instead somehow capitalizes on the kind of rhizomatic culture of all of these hundreds of thousands of people spending their hours in tournament play.
So the answer is there isn't.
I think the answer is yes. And what I mean by that is when I show a slide saying, hey, we could do a movie, we could do comic books, we could do novels, we could also do something else, because depth is something that transcends any of those mediums. We can produce, we don't know what we're gonna produce yet, but we're totally open to other forms of narrative besides traditional. But being able to go traditional is not a bad thing.
With whatever media you end up producing, comic book or whatever it ends up being, are you hoping to direct that as sort of to the fans, fan service, or are you hoping that could be something that could appeal to a wider audience that is not familiar with the game as it is?
So here's the thing. I think the answer is both, because if we make narrative that is really appealing to our existing players and we focus on that and we focus on doing the best job that's possible about that, I believe it will appeal to people who are not our players. So I don't think you want to, we all know the traditional movie thing is, well, the people already like it, or they're always gonna buy the ticket, so let's try and capture all the people who don't like it. And that's just not the way we approach things. Everything we do is driven on delivering player value to our players. And we believe that if you deliver a high quality product to an audience that loves it, it's gonna work out in the end. It sounds a little naive, but that's our approach.
All right, one more.
Nuts and bolts question. So at what point in the character development process do you tend to lock down on the character name?
Wow, that's an interesting one. So that's actually been much crazier than you might think. We've been trying a lot of different naming processes. So here's an interesting thing. I found there's nothing more debated and that people get more passionate about than a name. Putting a name to a champion really tends to divide people, and I don't know if we've actually figured out the exact right process for figuring that out. We have something that we're trying now that's new, but it's probably better for me to just admit that is an ongoing issue, and people are very, very passionate about names. I guess some useful stuff I can share is that once a name gets out there, for good or for bad, it becomes embedded in people's psyche. So be very wary of code names, because before you know it, the entire dev team will be convinced, no, that's an awesome fucking name. We should totally roll that out. The players are gonna love that. But they've just become mentally attached to the name. So you probably either want to use code names like Elise's code name was Spider Queen, for example. No one actually thought we'd call her. Well, actually, she came out as Elise the Spider Queen, so there you go. Either use those, use code names, or figure it out early, figure out an amazing name, and get it out to the team early so that people can get locked in on that amazing name.
All right, Eric's giving me transmission for lunch.
Okay, so in Dota 2, right, all the champions, they don't have names. They just have, what they are.
Mm-hmm.
So there's the anti-mage,
Yep.
the invoker. It's what they do.
Yep.
But without a name, it's still very complex.
Mm-hmm.
So, okay, question is, why is the name so important?
So I think Dota 2 is actually a great example of that anchoring process. What I believe is that there just wasn't a ton of thought put into the naming of Dota 2 characters, but people learned the name and they became anchored to it, and now it's a great name. Some of our character names are not too great either. People, like Caitlyn, for example. I love Caitlyn. She's like this range shooter, but Caitlyn is not really that exciting a name. We have a character named Maokai. He's a tree, and we just have a developer named Maokai, and we just named it after him. And people are attached to it. So I guess the moral of the story is whatever name you give to character, people will get attached to it, and over time they'll probably like it.
I'm curious, so you recognize that you had a tournament IP. I'm curious how much you looked at sports as sort of in the real world. You take something like the NFL and see how ESPN turns it into an emergent narrative. You take something like WWE and see how it's very much an author narrative. I'm curious how that influenced your story development process.
So that's a great observation. That is completely ancillary, or maybe ancillary isn't the word. It's separate from our in-game lore story development, but we definitely recognize the importance of narrative from a sports perspective. So for example, I'll just give an example from myself as a fan of League of Legends as a sport. There's a team, CLG.EU, and they have this guy who plays mid, which is a mage role named Froggen. When I first time I saw Froggen play, I was like, Froggen is awesome, and people are talking about Froggen, and I just got interested in the team because of that specific guy. And then I learned about Snoopy, who's another character on, another player on their team, and I became interested in him because he has this thing called the Death Stare. And you start to really get interested in who the people are on these teams and their relationships. When you know, like, oh, when TSM loses to a Zubu Blaze, you know, that's kind of a talking about Korea versus America, and you start to form these narratives. So we're aware that players form these narratives naturally. We want to assist them in forming positive narratives, and the people we have who are casting try and be very aware of these narratives so they can reference them, because that helps the players connect to the game as a sport.
Exactly. Building off that, I had a very interesting conversation with some friends on Twitter the other day, talking about how you will see in a broadcasted League of Legends match, players referred to both as their character and by their name, like interchangeably. The way you will also see in a football game the quarterback's name, but they'll also just refer to the quarterback, right? And it's interesting how those names, even though they're also attached to all this lore, are attached to like roles on the team in the same way that a quarterback sort of is a specific role. All right, last question. You've had your hand up for a while.
I'm not sure if you really addressed the lore problem of character or character agency in the context of the arena. Without if there isn't a character agency, then there isn't really much of a character narrative. Do you think that's a problem that needs to be solved?
Yes.
That was great.